Sheriff Tom Briggs was the kind of man people looked up to. In his small, quiet town, his word was law, his handshake a promise. For years, he was the first face neighbors turned to in times of need. The one who would show up, no questions asked, to calm fears and deliver justice. Behind his badge was a man of order, duty, and loyalty. To the people of Coldwater, he wasn't just the sheriff. He was their peacekeeper, their protector, and to some, their last hope in moments of despair. For those who knew him, there was no reason to doubt his life was just as steadfast as his principles. He had a devoted wife, a bright, young son, and a best friend who was more like a brother. Together, they were fixtures of the community, appearing at church picnics, coaching little league games, and volunteering at charity events. His world seemed unshakable, a life built on trust, held together by the strength of his character. But life has a way of exposing the cracks in even the strongest facades. It started with something routine, a health scare for his son, nothing too alarming. Doctors recommended genetic testing, just to rule out potential risks. It should have been a simple answer to a simple question. But when the results came in, the answers were anything but simple. What Sheriff Briggs saw on that paper wasn't just medical data. It was the key to a betrayal so deep it didn't just change how he saw his family. It changed the man he thought he was. What do you do when the person lying to you isn't a criminal on the other side of the law, but the people you've built your entire life around? When the very foundation of your world, the love of your wife, the loyalty of your best friend, turns out to be a lie. For Sheriff Briggs, it was a question that didn't just haunt him, it consumed him. He was a man used to solving problems, finding the truth, and delivering justice. But this time, the problem wasn't out there. It was right in front of him, in his home, his marriage, his own family. The discovery came with devastating clarity. The son he had raised, the boy he called his own, wasn't his child. And the father, not a stranger, not a mistake, his best friend, a man he trusted with everything, including his life. What followed wasn't a gradual descent. It was a rupture, a breaking point. The sheriff who swore to uphold the law, who had spent his life protecting others, made a choice. A choice to silence the betrayal, to erase the lies with finality. A choice that would leave 2 people dead and an entire town reeling. Tonight, we unravel the story of Sheriff Tom Briggs. The father, the husband, the lawman, and the killer. What could drive a man of such honor to commit the ultimate crime? And how did a badge once seen as a symbol of justice become a symbol of terror? This is the story of trust broken, love betrayed, and the devastating cost of secrets that refused to stay hidden. Tom Briggs wasn't just the sheriff of Coldwater, he was the heart of it. In a town with a population small enough for everyone to know your name, Briggs was a man whose presence offered comfort. His career, spanning nearly 2 decades, was a badge of honor not just pinned to his chest, but etched into the identity of the community itself. Known for his firm handshake and measured words, he was the kind of man who could silence a room with his presence, not through intimidation, but respect. Before he was a sheriff, he was a deputy, patrolling the same streets he'd grown up on. Locals say he had a knack for diffusing tense situations, a skill that earned him the trust of both his colleagues and the townspeople. From rescuing stray pets to overseeing large criminal cases, Tom Briggs wasn't just a lawman. He was a protector, a man everyone believed had their best interests at heart. To the outside world, his life seemed simple, idyllic even. A loving wife, a bright young son, and a best friend who was practically family. Together, they painted a picture of stability, a tight-knit group against the backdrop of an even tighter-knit town. But pictures are just that. Images meant to be seen, not heard. And when you look closer, sometimes they tell a different story. His wife, Margaret, was as much a part of Coldwater as Tom. Married for 15 years, she was known for her kindness and her presence at nearly every community event. From organizing charity drives to teaching Sunday school, she had woven herself into the fabric of the town's life. Together, she and Tom seemed like the ideal couple, often photographed at fundraisers. Their hands interlocked, smiles that spoke of devotion. But to those who knew them well or thought they did, there were subtle cracks beneath the surface. Friends recalled moments of tension, fleeting arguments at social gatherings, and quiet stretches of time where Margaret seemed to vanish into her own world. And then there was Sam Porter. Sam wasn't just Tom's best friend. He was his right hand, his deputy, his confidant. From the outside, the two men shared a bond forged by years of working side by side in the kind of situations that create unshakable loyalty. Sam was the one Tom turned to in moments of crisis, the one who had stood beside him through countless cases. He was part of the family, or at least it seemed that way. Sam had dinner at their house almost weekly. He was there for holidays, birthdays, even family vacations. To those looking in, Sam was a brother to Tom and an uncle to his son. But some in the town had started to notice what Tom seemed too busy, or perhaps too trusting, to see. Sam's presence wasn't just frequent. It was almost constant. And while most chalked it up to friendship, there were whispers, quiet, cautious whispers. Neighbors noticed the way Margaret and Sam exchanged glances, the way their laughter lingered just a bit too long. And then there were the moments that didn't require words at all. Moments when Margaret's absence was explained not by her errands, but by her silence. It was nothing anyone could prove, but it was enough to plant the seeds of doubt in a town where everyone watched each other's lives unfold like chapters of the same book. But if Tom noticed any of this, he didn't show it. He continued on, a man of routine, a man of structure. Every morning, he left for work at the same time, coffee in hand, his badge gleaming in the early light. He shook hands with shop owners, patted children on the head, and did his rounds with Sam. To those who saw him, Tom Briggs was unshakable, unwavering. But what no one knew, not yet, was that trust, once broken, doesn't just crack. It shatters. And for Tom Briggs, the first tremor was about to hit. It was a routine doctor's visit that set everything in motion. His son, Ryan, had been feeling unwell. Nothing serious, just a lingering fatigue that concerned Margaret enough to schedule an appointment. The doctor, as a precaution, suggested genetic testing, explaining that it could rule out any underlying issues. Tom agreed without hesitation. He trusted science just as he trusted his family. To him, it was another box to check, another part of being a good parent. But when the results arrived, they carried more than a diagnosis. They carried the weight of a truth that would upend everything. In the days that followed, Tom became withdrawn, his once steady presence now marked by moments of absence. He stopped attending dinners, avoided eye contact with Margaret, and found reasons to stay out late, driving aimlessly through the empty streets of Coldwater. For the first time in his life, he felt like a stranger in his own home. And while Margaret and Sam carried on, unaware, or perhaps pretending to be, Tom was quietly piecing together a puzzle he hadn't asked to solve. By the time the pieces began to fit, it was already too late. The trust that had defined his life, the trust in his wife, his best friend, and even himself was gone. All that remained was a man who had built his life on justice, now faced with a choice no law could answer. What do you do when the people you trust the most become the very people who betray you? For Tom Briggs, the answer would change Coldwater forever. It began with a cough. Nothing alarming at first. Just a faint, dry sound that came and went without much thought. But over the weeks, it lingered, weaving itself into the quiet moments of their home. By the time the fatigue set in, Margaret insisted on taking Ryan to the doctor. Tom, ever the dutiful father, agreed. It was just precautionary, the kind of thing parents did without hesitation. After all, what harm could come from knowing more? The doctor was reassuring, his voice calm as he explained the plan. Blood tests, a few scans, simple things to rule out anything serious. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the genetic panel. It's standard these days, he said, smiling. Just a way to get a fuller picture. Tom didn't think twice. He signed the forms, patted Ryan on the shoulder, and promised they'd get ice cream on the way home. To him, it was just another step, one of the countless small sacrifices parents make for their children. Days passed and life continued. Tom returned to his routine, arresting petty thieves and mediating neighborhood disputes. He even smiled when Sam dropped by with coffee and a joke about how Ryan was probably faking to get out of school. Margaret busied herself with the PDA, assuring anyone who asked that Ryan was fine, just a little under the weather. And for a while, it seemed like that would be the end of it. Until the phone call. Tom was in his office when it came. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, but there was a hesitation, a crack in their practice tone that made Tom sit up straighter. "Sheriff Briggs," the doctor began, "we have the results of Ryan's tests. Everything looks fine, nothing to worry about health-wise. But..." There was a pause, the kind of pause that carries weight, the kind that forces you to hold your breath. "There's something in the genetic panel I thought you should be aware of." Tom listened, pen in hand, scribbling notes he would never need to read again. The doctor spoke in careful terms, explaining alleles and markers, a clinical language meant to soften the blow. But the meaning was unmistakable. Ryan's DNA didn't match Tom's. Not in the way it should. Not in the way it had to. He thanked the doctor, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest, and hung up the phone. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at the badge on his desk, the familiar weight of it now feeling foreign. That night, Tom didn't say a word to Margaret. He watched her move through the house, her laughter ringing out as she helped Ryan with his homework. He noticed the way she leaned in to kiss his forehead, the way she brushed his hair back with practiced affection. And for the first time in their marriage, he felt like an outsider, a stranger watching a life that wasn't his own. The questions came in waves, relentless and unanswerable. How? When? Why? He replayed every memory, every shared glance, every conversation with Margaret, searching for clues he hadn't known to look for. And then, like a match struck in the dark, one name came to mind. Sam. At first, it seemed impossible. Sam, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him at his wedding, who had held Ryan in the hospital minutes after he was born, the man who had shared beers on the porch, trading stories about the future they were building. But the more Tom thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit. Sam's jokes about being Ryan's fun uncle, the way he lingered just a little too long after dinners, the whispered conversations with Margaret that stopped the moment Tom entered the room. Tom knew he couldn't confront them, not yet. He needed proof, something undeniable. And so, the sheriff became an investigator, not of crimes on the streets, but of the secrets within his own home. He started small, combing through old photos. In every image, there was Sam, always close to Margaret, always smiling. Then came the text messages. Late at night, while Margaret slept, Tom scrolled through her phone, his hands trembling as he read the words that confirmed his worst fears. "Can't wait to see you," one message read. "I'm glad we had this time alone." And then, the one that broke him, "We'll figure out a way to tell him. Someday." Tom printed the messages, each word cutting deeper than the last. But he didn't stop there. He went to the station, pulling surveillance footage from the cameras near his house. It was standard procedure, meant for catching trespassers or identifying suspicious vehicles. But what Tom found wasn't a stranger in the night. It was Sam's car, parked outside his home on nights Tom had been working late, hours unaccounted for, hidden in the quiet darkness of their betrayal. By the time Tom had pieced it all together, there was no denying the truth. The life he thought he had built wasn't just fractured, it was a lie. And as he sat in his office, staring at the evidence laid out before him, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not anger, not sadness, something deeper, heavier, something that couldn't be undone. Tom Briggs was a man of law, a man of justice. But in that moment, justice no longer felt like enough. For weeks, Sheriff Tom Briggs carried the weight of his discovery like a chain wrapped around his chest. Every glance, every word, every gesture from his wife and his best friend now felt tainted, rehearsed, calculated. The home that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a prison. Each room a reminder of the life he thought he had built, the lies hidden in plain sight. Night after night, Tom sat alone in his office, the lights off, the quiet hum of the town beyond his window offering no comfort. On his desk lay the evidence. Printouts of text messages, still frames from security footage, the DNA test results. And there, in the center of it all, a family photo. Margaret smiling, Ryan in his arms, Sam standing beside them, his hand on Tom's shoulder. The image blurred as Tom stared at it, his grip tightening until the frame cracked beneath his fingers. Tom Briggs had dedicated his life to justice, to upholding the law with fairness and restraint. But now, in the shadow of betrayal, the principles he had lived by began to erode. At first, he tried to rationalize the emotions surging through him. Humiliation, anger, heartbreak. He told himself he could confront them, demand answers, put the pieces of his life back together. But the questions lingered in his mind, unrelenting. Was Ryan ever his son in their eyes? How long had they been laughing behind his back, sharing stolen moments while he worked late nights to provide for them? Asterisk. Each thought festered, feeding a rage he couldn't control. It wasn't the kind of anger that came in fiery bursts, but a cold, steady burn. A heat that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for release. Tom stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. His once steady hands now trembled as he poured his morning coffee. The people in town noticed the change, the way their once approachable sheriff had grown distant, the shadows under his eyes deepening with each passing day. But no one dared to ask. After all, even good men have their breaking points. The moment it all came crashing down wasn't marked by an outburst or a confrontation. It came in silence, late one night, as Tom sat in his chair, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He stared at the stack of evidence, his mind replaying the conversations, the lies, the stolen moments. He reached for his badge, turning it over in his hand. Once it had symbolized everything he believed in: order, honor, integrity. But now it felt like a hollow weight, a reminder of a man he no longer recognized. They took everything, he whispered to himself, his voice breaking in the empty room. And in that moment, something shifted. The man who had spent his life seeking justice now found himself consumed by a desire for something far simpler: revenge. Asterisk. Tom's transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was methodical, calculated. He began to plan not as a sheriff, but as a man with nothing left to lose. He knew the law better than anyone in town, its loopholes, its blind spots, its weaknesses. And he used that knowledge to his advantage. He started small, erasing any traces of his intentions. He paid cash for an unregistered firearm, purchased from a man who didn't ask questions. He drove to the next county over, using back roads to avoid detection, his face hidden beneath a baseball cap. He chose his weapon carefully, something simple, efficient, untraceable. Asterisk. Back in his office, he marked dates on his calendar, circling nights when Margaret and Sam would both be within reach. He tracked their routines, noting the times they left the house, the places they frequented. He rehearsed his plan in his mind, running through every detail, every possible outcome. The precision of it all was almost clinical, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. As the nights passed, Tom became a ghost in his own home. Margaret would ask if he was okay, her voice filled with concern. He would nod, offering a small smile, all the while noting the way she avoided his gaze. Sam continued to drop by unannounced, his familiar laugh echoing through the house. But now, Tom saw it for what it was: the sound of a man who believed he had gotten away with everything. And while the town slept peacefully, unaware of the storm building within their trusted sheriff, Tom Briggs sat in his darkened office, staring at the tools of his trade: the badge, the gun, the evidence. The man who had once upheld the law was now plotting its greatest betrayal. It wasn't justice he sought anymore. It was balance. And the scales in his eyes had tipped too far. The plan was simple, precise. It had to be. Tom knew there would be no second chances. He chose the night carefully. A night when Ryan would be at a friend's house. A night when the air was thick with the kind of quiet that let you hear every creak, every whisper. He rehearsed the moments in his mind like a script, each step leading to the inevitable conclusion. But what he didn't plan for, what no amount of preparation could have accounted for, was the weight of the choice he was about to make. Tom Briggs had spent years standing on the line between chaos and order, protecting the people of Coldwater from the worst the world had to offer. But now, he was the chaos, and the only thing standing between him and the end was a single moment of hesitation. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles heavily over a small town when most of its residents are asleep, their windows glowing faintly from forgotten bedside lamps. Sheriff Tom Briggs was not among them. He had been preparing for this moment, watching the clock tick down with an unshakable calm. The plan was set, the steps rehearsed. He knew there was no turning back. The call went out just before 8 p.m. Margaret picked up after the second ring, her voice soft, tired. "Tom?" she asked. His response was steady, almost too steady. "I need you and Sam to meet me at the cabin. We need to talk. About us." There was a pause, just long enough for him to imagine the way her eyes might flick to Sam, who was undoubtedly close by. But she didn't question it. She simply agreed, her voice carefully neutral. The cabin had always been a place of solace for Tom. A small, weathered structure nestled deep in the woods, far from the hum of the town. It was where he went to think, to decompress. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. By 9 p.m., he was there, the truck parked discreetly in the shadows of the trees. Inside the cabin, he moved with precision, setting the stage. A single lamp on the table cast a pale glow, its light barely reaching the corners of the room. The chairs were arranged neatly, 3 of them forming a careful triangle around the table. In the center, an unopened bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses stood like props in a play. He opened the windows slightly, letting in the cool night air, the faint scent of pine mingling with the sharp tang of gun oil from the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. He didn't have to wait long. At 9:17 p.m., he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, the soft hum of an engine cutting out. He watched from the shadows as Margaret stepped out of the car, her silhouette illuminated briefly by the dome light. Sam followed, his figure larger, heavier, the sound of his boots deliberate against the ground. They exchanged a few words. Tom couldn't hear them, but he didn't need to. He knew exactly what they were saying, exactly what they were thinking. He turned away from the window, his heart pounding in his chest, but his face betraying nothing. When they entered, Margaret looked around, her brow furrowed. "Tom," she called, her voice tinged with hesitation. Sam was quieter, his eyes scanning the room, lingering briefly on the whiskey bottle. Tom stepped out from the shadows, his boots heavy against the floorboards. "Sit," he said simply, his voice devoid of warmth. Margaret hesitated, her confusion evident, but Sam nudged her gently toward the chair. They sat, their bodies angled toward him, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. For a moment, the only sound was the faint creak of the cabin settling, the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Tom stood by the window, his back to them, staring out into the darkness. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured. "How long?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting in her lap. "Tom, I don't." He cut her off, turning to face them, his eyes dark and unyielding. "How long has it been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. It was Sam who broke first, his voice firm but uneasy. "Tom, let's just talk about this. It's not what you think." Tom's laugh was sharp, bitter, echoing off the wooden walls. "Not what I think?" He stepped closer, his hand resting on the back of the empty chair. "You think I don't know? You think I didn't put it together? The messages, the late nights, the DNA test." He let the words linger, watching as the color drained from Margaret's face. Sam rose to his feet, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Tom, let's calm down. We can figure this out." But Tom didn't move. His hands slid beneath his jacket, his fingers closing around the cold metal of the gun. "Calm down," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want me to calm down after you took everything from me?" The first shot was deafening in the confined space, the sound reverberating off the walls. Margaret screamed, her chair toppling as she scrambled backward, her hands clutching at the air as if to ward off the inevitable. Sam fell hard, the force of the bullet sending him sprawling across the floor. Tom didn't flinch. He stepped over Sam's body, his eyes fixed on Margaret. She was pleading now, her words choked and frantic. "Tom, please, please, don't do this." The second shot silenced her, her body crumpling to the floor in a lifeless heap. For a moment, the cabin was still, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Tom stood there, his breath heavy, his hand trembling around the gun. He stared down at them, the people who had betrayed him, and felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness that swallowed him whole. Tom Briggs was a man who had spent his life delivering justice. But on that night, he became something else entirely. He wiped the gun clean, placing it carefully on the table. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the liquid trembling in the glass as he lifted it to his lips. Outside, the woods were silent, the kind of silence that doesn't question or judge. But the cabin told a story he couldn't erase. The bloodstains on the floor, the overturned chair, the empty whiskey bottle beside the gun. Forensic evidence would reveal it all, the trajectory of the bullets, the angle of the shots, the fingerprints on the weapon. And when the town awoke the next morning, their sheriff would no longer be a man they could trust, but the man they feared most. The crime scene at the cabin was both chaotic and calculated. Blood spattered across the wooden floor told one story, but the precise placement of the weapon and the untouched whiskey glasses hinted at another. The responding officers, who arrived following an anonymous tip, found themselves standing in disbelief. Sheriff Tom Briggs, Coldwater's symbol of law and order, was nowhere to be found. The cabin that had once been a quiet retreat now bore the marks of a violent, unthinkable act. At first, the investigation moved slowly. The bodies of Margaret and Sam were discovered side by side, each with a single gunshot wound. The evidence was plentiful but perplexing. A pistol, wiped clean of fingerprints, rested on the table. Shell casings matched the bullets recovered from the victims, but without an obvious suspect, the pieces seemed scattered. However, the forensic team knew one truth: crime scenes don't lie. The first clue came from the ballistics report. The gun used in the murders was unregistered, but the make and model were familiar to anyone in law enforcement. It was a common choice among off-duty officers, discreet, reliable, and easy to obtain without drawing attention. As investigators delved deeper, their suspicions turned toward the person who knew the system better than anyone else: Sheriff Tom Briggs himself. In the days following the murders, Tom's absence became glaring. Colleagues at the station began to piece together the oddities in his behavior. In the weeks leading up to the crime, he had grown distant, missing routine check-ins and avoiding his usual haunts. His once methodical reports were riddled with mistakes, and his explanations for his late-night drives were vague at best. One officer recalled seeing him leave the station the night of the murders, his face pale, his hands trembling as he gripped his truck's steering wheel. Then came the phone records. Investigators combed through weeks of calls and messages, noting the patterns. Tom had made numerous calls to Margaret in the days before the murders, short, terse conversations that ended abruptly. But it was his call to Sam that stood out, placed just hours before the killings. The message was simple: "Meet me at the cabin. We need to talk." Witnesses also began to step forward, each adding another layer to the growing suspicion. A neighbor reported seeing Tom's truck parked outside the cabin earlier that evening. A store clerk remembered selling him a box of ammunition just a week prior. Each statement, each piece of evidence, painted a picture of a man unraveling, his actions no longer those of a protector but of a predator. The break in the case came when detectives revisited the cabin, retracing every step. Beneath the overturned chair, they found a single, overlooked detail: a partial boot print. The tread pattern matched the boots Tom wore almost daily. It was circumstantial, but it was enough to secure a warrant. And on a rainy Thursday morning, as the town stirred from its slumber, Sheriff Tom Briggs was arrested in the very office where he had upheld the law for over a decade. The arrest was swift, clinical. Officers moved in with quiet precision, their faces a mix of sorrow and determination. Tom didn't resist. He stood behind his desk, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and raised his hands slowly. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Tom Briggs, the man who had once led these very officers, now stood among them as a suspect. As he was escorted out of the station, handcuffed and silent, the murmurs began. Townspeople gathered outside, their faces etched with shock, betrayal, and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had the man they trusted most become the man they feared? Tom kept his eyes forward, his expression unreadable, even as camera flashes captured his every step. Asterisk. The interrogation room was stark, its walls bare save for a clock ticking methodically above the door. Tom sat at the metal table, his reflection faint in its polished surface. Across from him, the lead investigator, a younger man who had once idolized Tom, now leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Sheriff Briggs," he began, "you know how this works. We have the evidence, the ballistics, the phone records, the witnesses. Tell us what happened." Tom didn't answer immediately. He stared at the table, his jaw tight, his hands clasped in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his words heavy with resignation. The investigator pressed on, sliding photos across the table. "Margaret, Sam, the crime scene. Help us understand, Tom. Why did it have to end like this?" For hours, the room remained locked in a tense rhythm. Questions met with silence. Accusations met with the occasional flicker of emotion. At one point, the investigator played an audio recording. Tom's call to Sam, his voice calm but loaded with intent. "Meet me at the cabin," the recording echoed. "We need to talk." Tom's reaction was subtle, a single tear slipping down his cheek, quickly wiped away. But it wasn't until the investigator mentioned Ryan that Tom finally broke. Slamming his fists on the table, he shouted, his voice raw and cracked. "You don't know what it's like to give everything to your family, to trust your best friend, and find out it was all a lie." His breathing was ragged, his composure shattered. For a brief moment, the weight of his actions seemed to crash down on him all at once. Asterisk. The confession came slowly, each word dragging the room deeper into silence. Tom described the betrayal, the anger, the plan. He spoke of the cabin, the whiskey, the gun. His voice trembled as he recounted pulling the trigger, his eyes distant as if reliving the moment. When he finished, the room was quiet save for the sound of the clock ticking above. The lead investigator leaned back, his face pale. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said quietly. "We'll take it from here." The trial of Sheriff Tom Briggs was a spectacle unlike anything Coldwater had ever seen. For weeks, the courthouse became the epicenter of a story that had already shattered the small town. The man who had once been their protector, their hero, now sat at the defendant's table, dressed not in the uniform that had once commanded respect, but in a plain gray suit, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn. The prosecution wasted no time. Piece by piece, they laid out the evidence, their voices echoing through the silent courtroom. Ballistics reports, phone records, forensic findings, all of it painting a damning picture of premeditated murder. The jury was shown the timeline, from the purchase of the unregistered weapon to the fateful night at the cabin. They listened to the recordings, Tom's own voice calling Sam to the scene, calm and deliberate. Then came the crime scene photos. The images were stark, brutal, and undeniable. Margaret's lifeless body sprawled across the floor, Sam's blood pooling beneath him, his outstretched hand frozen mid-reach. The jury shifted uncomfortably as each photo was presented, the weight of the evidence settling heavily in the room. Asterisk. The defense tried to offer an alternative narrative. They spoke of a man driven to the edge, pushed beyond reason by betrayal and heartbreak. They called witnesses who testified to Tom's years of service, his sacrifices, his unwavering commitment to the town. They argued that this wasn't the act of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man who had been broken by the very people he trusted most. But the evidence was unrelenting, the prosecution's case airtight. Perhaps the most chilling moment came when the prosecution replayed a portion of Tom's confession. His voice, flat and emotionless, described the final moments in the cabin. The way Margaret's plea had echoed in his ears, the way the gun felt in his hand, the moment he decided there was no other way. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. Even the judge, a man known for his stoic demeanor, looked visibly shaken. When the time came for the jury to deliberate, there was little doubt about the outcome. And yet, the hours stretched on, each passing moment tightening the tension in the room. Tom sat motionless, his hands clasped in his lap, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. He didn't flinch when the bailiff announced the jury's return. He didn't move when the foreman rose to read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Briggs, guilty on all charges. The words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Tom closed his eyes briefly, a flicker of something, relief, resignation, or perhaps regret, crossing his face. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, reporters scrambling to file their stories, spectators whispering in hushed tones. But for Tom, the noise seemed distant, unimportant. His fate had been sealed. The verdict sent shockwaves through Coldwater. The townsfolk, many of whom had known Tom their entire lives, struggled to reconcile the man they had trusted with the actions he had taken. Some spoke of betrayal, their voices tinged with anger and disbelief. "He was supposed to protect us," one resident said, her eyes glistening with tears. "If we couldn't trust him, who can we trust?" Others expressed sorrow, remembering the Tom Briggs they thought they knew. "He wasn't always like this," an old friend said, his voice heavy with sadness. "Something broke inside him. I just wish we had seen it before it was too late." The community itself seemed fractured, its once close bonds strained under the weight of the tragedy. The sheriff's office, once a symbol of safety and stability, now stood as a grim reminder of what had been lost. Deputies who had worked alongside Tom spoke of the tension in the air, the way his actions had cast a shadow over their work. "It's hard to put on this uniform now," one officer admitted. "Every time I do, I think about him and what he did." But perhaps the most heartbreaking reactions came from those closest to the case. Ryan, Tom and Margaret's son, was placed in the care of distant relatives. His face, once bright with childhood innocence, now seemed older, weighed down by a grief too large for someone his age. He didn't attend the trial, but those who saw him said he rarely spoke, his eyes often fixed on the ground. In the weeks that followed, the town tried to move forward, but the scars remained. The cabin was boarded up, its once welcoming exterior now weathered and forgotten. The house where the Briggs family had lived was sold, the new owners repainting the walls in an attempt to erase the past. But for those who had lived through it, the memory of what happened could not be so easily brushed away. As for Tom Briggs, his days of delivering justice were over. Sentenced to life without parole, he now resides in a prison far from the town he once served. In interviews, he speaks rarely, his answers brief and detached. When asked if he regrets his actions, his response is always the same. A long pause, followed by a quiet, "It doesn't matter anymore." For Coldwater, the story of Sheriff Briggs is more than just a cautionary tale. It's a reminder of the fragility of trust, of the cost of secrets, and of the devastating consequences of betrayal. The man they once called their hero is now a ghost in their memories, a shadow cast over a town that will never be the same. Trust is the foundation of every relationship, the invisible thread that binds families, friendships, and communities. But what happens when that trust is broken? When the people we hold closest to our hearts become the very ones who betray us? The story of Sheriff Tom Briggs isn't just a tale of crime and punishment. It's a reflection of the devastating cost of secrets and the choices they force us to make. It's a reminder of how fragile our relationships can be and how, in a single moment, they can unravel completely. But perhaps the most haunting question remains. Could it have ended differently? Was there a moment where this tragedy could have been avoided, where trust could have been repaired instead of destroyed? Or was Tom Briggs always destined to become the man he never thought he could be? Asterisk. Now we turn to you. If you were in Tom's shoes, how would you have handled the betrayal? Could you have walked away? Or do you think his actions were inevitable? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're as captivated by true crime stories as we are, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. We'll continue to bring you the most gripping, haunting, and unforgettable stories from the darker corners of human behavior. Asterisk. Thank you for watching. And remember, trust is a fragile thing. Handle it with care.